There are foods that were once so common, so present in the daily life of this country that no one thought to protect them. No one wrote down the recipes with any urgency. No one took photographs of the finished dish or saved the menu from the restaurant or thought to ask the person who made it best how exactly they did what they did. Because why would you? These foods were everywhere. They would always be here. And then, one decade at a time, they weren't. Today, we're counting down 10 American foods that were once genuinely famous, loved by millions, present at tables and lunch counters in restaurants across the country, and that have now faded so thoroughly from American life that most people under 50 have never tasted them, and many have never heard of them. But this is not simply a list of things that went out of fashion. It is a record of how a food culture loses itself, quietly, gradually, without anyone making a single decision that this is what will happen. By the time we reach number 1, you may find yourself understanding the American table in a way that changes how you see the one in front of you right now. Number 10, chop suey. There was a time in the 20th century, stretching from roughly the 1890s through the latter half of the 20th century, when chop suey was one of the most popular dishes in America. Chinese-American restaurants serving it could be found in virtually every city and town of any size from coast to coast, and the dish had become so thoroughly absorbed into American eating that most people who ordered it thought of it as simply dinner rather than as any particular cuisine. Chop suey, a stir-fry of bean sprouts, celery, onion, water chestnuts, and whatever protein was available, bound in a thin, savory sauce and served over rice or crispy fried noodles, was invented not in China, but in the Chinese-American kitchens of California and New York in the late 19th century, a practical creation designed to feed American workers quickly and inexpensively from Chinese pantry staples. It was beloved for 3 generations. Then, as American familiarity with actual regional Chinese cooking grew through the latter half of the 20th century, chop suey came to be seen as a simplified approximation rather than the real thing, and diners moved on to other dishes. The restaurants that had built themselves around it closed over decades and were not replaced. The dish is still made in homes that remember it, but the era when it was everywhere is over, and it is not coming back. Number 9, the automat. The automat was not a food exactly, it was a system for delivering food, and the food it delivered was so bound up with the experience of the place that separating them is almost impossible. The horn and hard art automats that operated primarily in New York and Philadelphia from the early 20th century through the 1970s were restaurants of a completely original kind, long walls of small glass-fronted compartments, each one holding a single portion of a prepared dish, a slice of pie, a bowl of baked beans, a plate of macaroni and cheese, a chicken pot pie, for which you deposited the correct number of nickels and opened the little door and took your food. The food itself was made fresh in the kitchen behind the wall, replenished constantly, maintained at the correct temperature. It was honest, inexpensive, consistent, and good. The baked beans were genuinely excellent. The coffee from the dolphin-headed spigots was reliably strong. The pies were made on the premises. The automat fed working people, office workers, students, and the simply curious for decades, and it created a democratic dining experience unlike anything else in American food history. The last New York automat closed in 1991. Nothing that operates on its principles, simplicity, quality, low cost, and genuine food has replaced it.
Number 8, oyster stew. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, oyster stew was a dish of genuine American prominence, served at celebrations, at Christmas Eve dinners across the country, at the lunch counters and seafood houses of coastal cities, and, because canned oysters made them available inland, in the kitchens of landlocked states far from any shoreline. The preparation was simple and ancient. Oysters barely cooked in their own liquor, with whole milk or cream, butter, salt, and pepper, served in a deep bowl with oyster crackers floating on top. The key was in the not cooking. The oysters went into the hot cream and were removed from the heat before they curled and toughened, remaining plump and briny and tender in a broth that tasted of the sea. It was a dish that required good oysters and careful technique and nothing else. The decline of wild oyster beds through pollution and over-harvesting through the mid-20th century made truly fresh oysters increasingly expensive and increasingly inaccessible outside coastal areas. The dish retreated. It can still be found in certain New England seafood houses and at certain holiday tables where the tradition has been maintained. But the era when oyster stew was a standard of American domestic cooking is gone. Number 7. The Blue Plate Special. The Blue Plate Special was not a single dish, it was a concept. And the concept was this: a complete meal served on a single divided plate at a price low enough that a working person could afford it without thinking twice. In the diners and lunch counters of America from the 1920s through the 1960s, the Blue Plate Special appeared on hand-lettered signs and in chalk on blackboards every weekday. A rotating selection that might be pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans on Monday, meatloaf and gravy and coleslaw on Tuesday, pork chops and applesauce and biscuits on Wednesday. The plate itself was often blue, a heavy, divided ceramic restaurant plate that kept the components separate, and the price was fixed and low, and the food was made from scratch in a kitchen where someone had started the pot roast that morning. The Blue Plate Special was the working American's lunch, eaten quickly at a counter stool or a small table, often alone, on the way back to an afternoon of physical labor. The rise of fast food, which offered speed and low cost, but not real cooking, drew the working lunch crowd away from the diners. The diners closed. The Blue Plate Special, as an institution, faded with them.
Number 6. The Ice Cream Soda. Before the milkshake became the dominant cold dairy beverage in American life, the ice cream soda held that position. And the ice cream soda was a more complicated, more refined, and arguably more delicious thing. Made at the soda fountain with carbonated water, flavored syrup, and 1 or 2 scoops of real ice cream, the ice cream soda produced a drink that was simultaneously cold and fizzy and creamy. The carbonation lifting the cream into a foam that gathered at the top and had to be eaten with a long spoon while the rest was sipped through a straw. The soda fountain where it was made was itself a social institution, a place where young people gathered, where dates were conducted, where the pharmacist who owned the counter knew his customers by name and kept their preferred flavors in stock. The soda fountain declined as the post-war suburban landscape reorganized itself around the automobile and the drive-thru, and the ice cream soda declined with it. The milkshake, which could be made and consumed more quickly and required less skill to produce, replaced it. The ice cream soda is still available at the few remaining old-fashioned soda fountains that survive, and everyone who tries one for the first time wonders why it ever stopped being everywhere. Number 5. Syllabub. Syllabub is a word that most Americans today would not recognize, and yet it was a beloved dessert and drink in colonial and early American kitchens from the 17th through the 19th century, and in certain southern households it persisted well into the 20th. At its simplest, syllabub was cream whipped with sugar and wine or cider until it formed a thick, sweet, slightly alcoholic foam that was spooned into glasses and eaten with a long spoon while the rest was sipped through a straw. The more elaborate versions were thickened and flavored with lemon zest and left to set in a cool place until the cream layer separated from the wine below, producing a 2-part dessert of cloud-like cream over sharp, clear wine. It was the dessert of celebration, of holiday tables, of the kind of occasion that called for something light and festive and slightly indulgent. It required only cream, sugar, wine, and a strong arm for the whipping. It faded as the European dessert traditions it belonged to were replaced by the cake mixes and gelatin desserts of the industrial food era, and as the knowledge of how to make it passed out of common practice without being formally preserved. It exists today mainly in historical cookbooks. Making it, for the first time in a modern kitchen, feels like recovering something that should never have been lost.
Number 4. Boiled dinner. The New England boiled dinner, a single pot of corned beef, cabbage, potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets, simmered together for hours until each component was tender and the broth had absorbed the flavor of everything in it, was a Saturday staple in New England households from the colonial era through the mid-20th century, and a dish known and eaten well beyond the region that gave it its name. It required one pot and a long morning and patience. The corned beef provided the salt and the fat and the deep, beefy richness that the broth carried throughout the vegetables. The beets, added late in the cooking, bled their extraordinary color into the pot and turned everything around them a brilliant, dark pink. The cabbage softened into something sweet and silky that bore little resemblance to raw cabbage. It was eaten with mustard and horseradish, and with the cooking broth as a soup or a drink alongside. The leftovers, the red flannel hash made from chopped beets and potatoes and corned beef, fried in a cast-iron skillet, were considered by many who knew the dish to be even better than the original. The boiled dinner faded as the particular New England food culture that had sustained it for 3 centuries was diluted by the homogenizing force of national food media and the convenience food industry. It is still made in families that have kept the tradition. Outside those families, it is largely unknown. Number 3. Beaten biscuits. The beaten biscuit is one of the most labor-intensive preparations in the history of American domestic cooking, and that labor, the hundreds of strokes required to work a stiff dough until it blistered and became smooth and pliable, is exactly why it has disappeared. A beaten biscuit is nothing like a Southern buttermilk biscuit. It is a small, dense, hard, cracker-like thing, made from flour and lard and a small amount of salt and water that gets its texture not from leavening, but from the air worked into the dough by repeated beating and folding. Before the advent of the mechanical biscuit break, a simple roller that could do in minutes what hands took an hour to accomplish, beaten biscuits were made by hand on the back porch or the kitchen table, the dough slapped and folded and turned for as long as it took to reach the right consistency, which experienced cooks judged by feel and sound. The finished biscuits were small and pale and shatteringly crisp, with a texture entirely unlike any other bread, and they were considered the finest accompaniment to Virginia ham that the American table had ever produced. They required a skill that took years to develop and a time commitment that the modern world no longer accommodates. The knowledge of how to make them exists in print, but not in hands, which is not the same thing at all. Number 2. The Grand Hotel Sunday Supper, Terrapin Stew. In the gilded decades of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, terrapin stew, a rich, sherry-laced preparation of diamondback terrapin cooked with butter and cream and egg yolk and carefully picked from the shell, was one of the most celebrated and expensive dishes in American fine dining. It appeared at presidential banquets and at the tables of the grandest hotels in Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York and Washington. Diamondback terrapin, a small brackish water turtle native to the Atlantic coastal marshes, was harvested in enormous quantities to supply the demand, and it commanded prices that made it a luxury available only to the wealthy. The over-harvesting that followed those decades of demand drove terrapin populations to near collapse by the early 20th century, and conservation efforts that followed dramatically restricted the harvest. By the time the population had partially recovered, the culinary tradition that had surrounded the dish had been severed. The cooks who knew how to prepare it had retired or passed on. The restaurants that had served it had closed, and the social world that had made it a prestige food had transformed entirely. Number 1. The Great American Boarding House Table.
At the top of this list, above every individual dish, sits something that cannot be reduced to a single recipe: the boarding house table of the 19th and early 20th century, and the food culture it sustained. The boarding house was an institution that housed and fed working Americans, clerks and seamstresses and factory workers and traveling salesmen and the recently arrived, at a long common table where meals were served family style, at set hours, prepared by a woman who ran the house and whose cooking was the primary reason her boarders chose her establishment over the one down the street. The boarding house table produced, day after day, the most honest and capable cooking in American history. Pot roasts and stews and roasted chickens and fresh-baked bread and pies made from seasonal fruit and vegetables grown nearby, all prepared by someone who had been cooking for 20 or 30 people since before dawn, and who had learned her trade from a mother who had done the same. This food was not glamorous. It appeared in no restaurants. It received no reviews, but it fed the working population of American cities for a century. And the woman who made it, the boarding house keeper, was one of the most skilled and under-acknowledged cooks this country ever produced. Here is the truth that this entire list has been building toward. The foods on this countdown did not fade because they stopped being good. They faded because the systems that held them in place, the people, the knowledge, the institutions, the practices, were allowed to dissolve without any plan for what would replace them. The assumption in every case was that the food would always be there, that someone would always know how to make it. When that decision is not made, when the assumption of permanence substitutes for the work of preservation, the food fades, quietly, without ceremony. One empty seat at the counter, one closed kitchen, one recipe box that no one opens after the person who kept it is gone. The question this list leaves behind is not about any specific dish. It is about what we are currently allowing to fade right now in our own time, with the assumption that it will always be here. Because the people who ate oyster stew and syllabub and beaten biscuits made the same assumption, and they were wrong.